Hi, my name is Dr. Amber Wutich. I'm a President's Professor of Anthropology at Arizona State University and Director of its Center for Global Health. I'm also the Director of the NSF Cultural Anthropology Methods Program. And in this lecture, I'll cover sample size estimation for qualitative research. This is a really important and largely undercovered topic. The field of research on qualitative sample size is relatively young, and there are new findings coming out all the time. I'll cover some of these in this lecture. To begin, when we think about sampling, most people think about probability sampling. This is the family of random samples that's generally used in survey research for the purpose of finding research results that are generalizable to a population. That is not what is happening in non-probability sampling. Non-probability sampling is generally used for qualitative research, and it is a family of sampling tools that are used to intensely and in a detailed and rich way describe a phenomenon using qualitative methods. So the idea of non-probability sampling is never to generalize out to the population, but rather to do a thorough and deep job of describing a phenomenon. Now, it is possible to generalize from these qualitative findings, but you would need to draw another additional probability sample in a second stage of research. This is what we generally see in mixed methods research. In this lecture, however, we will just focus on the family of non-probability or purposeful samples that are generally used in qualitative research. And you can see here on the slide on the right-hand side that there are 4 kinds of samples that are generally used. In this lecture, we'll go step by step through how you would select and launch a sample for qualitative research. And the very first thing that you need to do is to select a research design. On this slide, I'm displaying a handful of common qualitative designs. These include ethnography, case studies, participatory research, phenomenology, photo voice, and narrative research. For all of these designs, we typically find people are trying to execute this goal of describing a phenomenon using qualitative data. And so the general guidance that I'll give at the beginning of this lecture will be relevant. Now, it's also true that people use qualitative research for some other purposes, such as comparative research. And in those cases, there are some special considerations about how to select your sample that we'll get to at the end of this lecture. But for now, let's focus on these common qualitative designs and their implications for sampling. Here on this slide, we see step 2, select a sampling approach. And I've displayed the 4 most commonly taught sampling approaches here. The first one in the lower right-hand corner is the convenience sample. This is a situation where you're studying a phenomenon in a place or with a group of people, and you just grab the people who are easiest to talk to. Many textbooks on qualitative research will caution you to never use a convenience sample because it builds in all kinds of biases. And this is really true. If you think about who's easiest to grab, there are a number of things about them, like having free time or being willing to talk to you, that make them unlike other people in the phenomenon. So if you restrict your sample to these convenience sampled people, it is going to mean that you're not able to thoroughly describe the phenomenon you're studying. A bad idea. Let's move over to the judgment sample. In a judgment sample, you would be using your expert knowledge of the phenomenon and the group that you're working with to choose people who manifest different qualities of the phenomenon. And if you go into the sampling literature and qualitative research, you'll find there are lots of ways that people do this. For example, sometimes they look for typical cases. In other situations, they look for maximum variation, so people on ends of the continuum in terms of the phenomenon they're studying. All of these are different kinds of judgment samples that are led by the expertise of the researcher and their knowledge of the population. And these judgment samples are generally seen as producing a good, reliable, robust description of a phenomenon that's studied using qualitative methods. The quota sample is a special case of the judgment sample. This is one where you know that there are going to be certain groups within your phenomenon, and you want to make sure that you get enough people from each of those groups. So for example, you could be looking for people who are different generations or different genders, but you know going in that you want to be sure that you talk to people in these different categories. And then the last one that's commonly used is what has historically been called a snowball sample. A snowball sample is particularly useful with hard-to-find populations, either because they're marginalized or often because they're experts. So you begin with a handful of seeds, people that you know that you have contact with and who can refer you to others. This works equally well, for example, with elites, such as policymakers or business people, as it does for people in marginalized populations who may not be open to being tracked. An important consideration in snowball sampling is consent. So just because a seed gave you someone's name doesn't mean that they consented to be contacted. So respondent-driven sampling is a modification of snowball sampling in which your seed gives out contact information to the people they have in mind, and then those people contact you. And this ensures that they're consenting to speak to you and be identified as a member of the population. There's a large literature on RDS, or respondent-driven sampling, that would be great to read up on if you plan to use this approach. Now, there's a very recent, exciting, and fast-moving literature that gives us guidance on the target sample size for conventional qualitative samples. So for step 3, I recommend that you review the sample size guidance that's in the literature now. Let's quickly look at that. There are a handful of studies that examine how many interviews are needed to reach code saturation, or something called data saturation or theme identification. So the idea is, how many interviews do you need to do using the kinds of sampling, purposeful sampling strategies we've just discussed to capture all of the main themes in a population? And you can see the top 4 studies I've listed are saying you need somewhere between 9 and 12 interviews to capture around 90% of the themes in a group. So that's an important finding to build on. But it's also important to notice the next 4 studies and their findings. Those studies are not just asking how many interviews it takes to identify themes. They're asking how many interviews does it take to get to something called meaning saturation, or a richly textured understanding of the themes. This means more than just being able to list them, but actually being able to richly describe the themes in the interviews. And so one method that people use to look at this is to see how many interviews it takes to find 3 or more repetitions of a theme. Another way people look at it is to actually try to describe the whole theme holistically. And you can see that it takes a minimum of between 16 and 24 interviews to reach meaning saturation. So when you are thinking about your target sample size, you want to consider, what is the purpose of the analysis? If your purpose is to identify themes because you are using a mixed methods design, and in stage 2, you'll create a survey that systematically asks respondents about the themes, then the guidance in the first 3 or 4 studies listed there would be appropriate. You need about probably 12 interviews to be able to discover the majority of the themes. However, if you want to do a whole thematic analysis and richly describe the themes to produce your research findings, you will need more interviews. You'll need somewhere probably on the scale of 16 to 24 interviews. So keep that in mind as you begin to plan your research design. For step 4, you'll want to probably think a little more thoroughly about what is the nature of repetition that you need. So this is the results of a modeling-based study by Fugard and Potts that tells us how many interviews we need to conduct depending on how many times you want to identify a theme, so how much meaning saturation you want, and how prevalent the theme actually is in the population. So as you can see, Fugard and Part's findings line up very well in that column 1 with what I showed you on the previous slide. You need somewhere between 10 and 16 interviews to find one instance of themes that occur in 10 to 15% of the population. But if you want to find 3, 4, or 5 instances of the theme, basically what you would need to reach meaning saturation, then you need to do much more research. You need to do probably between 28 and 66 interviews. Now, part of the trick here is in the judgment sampling. If you focus down on a population where almost everyone knows all of the themes, then you can see doing somewhere between 1 and 5 interviews should be enough to document those themes. But if you're drawing a much broader and more general sample, such that the prevalence of the theme is very low in the people you're surveying, you have to have more interviews. So this table is a really important one to keep in mind as you continue to consider what sample size target might be appropriate for your research design. Also, as you are writing up both a research proposal and writing up your findings for publication, you would want to be sure to cite this literature to justify your decision in drawing a target sample for qualitative research. Step 5 is just selecting your target sample size. That would be using the previous 2 slides we've discussed, determine what you want to do and what sample size is needed to do it. But as you begin to conduct your research and you begin to take on interviews, you should continuously reflect on saturation. What's the purpose of the analysis? Are you getting enough information to identify themes or to richly describe them? And then as you're closing out your data collection, be sure to check your final sample to ensure that it has sufficient range and depth to thoroughly describe the phenomenon or the themes that you're studying. So you can go in with a target sample size, but you always need to be reflective to ensure that you're getting what you need to really execute the research design that you had in mind and to thoroughly describe the themes you're studying. Now for tips and tricks. We will focus on 2 special cases. The special case number 1 is focus groups. People often think of focus groups as a collection of interviews, but that's not right. If you refer to the reminders I've given you, please recall that focus group literature indicates we should have 6 to 12 participants per focus group. And the participant is not the unit of analysis because people's responses can't be analyzed individually. For example, if I'm sitting next to someone in my focus group, I'm probably not going to repeat exactly what they said, even if I believe the same thing. So the fact that I chose not to say it doesn't mean that I don't think it. This is why the unit of analysis in a focus group design is the focus group. And when we look at the sample size guidance yielded from the research, we can see that it takes about 2 to 3 focus groups to get 80% of the themes identified in a phenomenon. With 4 focus groups, we might get up to 94% of themes identified. So the range that has historically been recommended for focus group research is 3 to 6 focus groups to get 80 to 90% of the themes. There have also been studies that look at meaning saturation or richly textured understanding of themes that indicate you will need 5 or more focus groups to reach meaning saturation. So if you have a focus group design or focus groups are a part of a multi-method design, be sure to refer to this literature and not the interview literature in justifying your sample size. Also, cross-cultural design is a kind of comparative qualitative design often adopted in anthropology. The literature on sample sizes for cross-cultural design is not yet large, but what we know is that if you're conducting within-group thematic identification, you can refer to the conventional interview literature in justifying your sample size. However, If you are conducting cross-site or meta-theme thematic analyses, you probably need a larger sample size. And the reason for this is that a theme that's prevalent in one site is often present but not prevalent in another site in your cross-cultural design. So the current literature recommends you would need between 20 and 40 interviews per site to be able to perform meta-theme analysis across sites. It's often worth noting that in sites that are more homogeneous or samples that are more homogeneous, researchers seem to reach thematic or data saturation more easily, but it takes longer to reach that cross-site meta-theme saturation. Conversely, in sites that seem to have more diverse samples, it takes longer to reach theme or more interviews to reach theme saturation, but less time to reach meta-theme saturation. So just something to keep in mind as you're composing purposeful samples for cross-cultural research, particularly if you have a meta-theme or cross-site qualitative design. Now to sum up. We have talked about some of the most common purposeful samples and some of the most common qualitative research designs in this lecture. It's important to acknowledge, however, that there are up to 40 purposeful sampling strategies documented in the literature. I refer you to Patton's wonderful textbook that covers these designs. Because the literature on qualitative sample size is so new, the literature has barely touched most of the kinds of purposeful samples that you see on this slide. This is humbling, but it's also very exciting because it means there is a lot of research left to be done on sample sizes and saturation for qualitative research. Hopefully, though, this lecture has been enough to give you a basic foundation and enough to move forward with your own research.